Just really briefly, because I'm pretty sure a lot of you in the room wouldn't be aware of the Australian Farm Institute and what we do. We're a small independent farm policy research organisation. While we're working on energy, we have a research priority setting process that we go through each year, and for the last couple of years, issues around energy affordability, reliable energy access for farming businesses has been one of the top priorities that's come through for us to work on from the policy context. And so as a result of that, thanks very much to Energy Consumers Australia, we've now got a project that is looking at one of the first things we realised is just the level of information around, again, the affordability context and the impact that it has on farming businesses of energy is really lacking in the agriculture sector. Most of the discussion tends to be case study type discussion around the impact on single businesses and so on. But the ability to say that a change in the price of energy will have this much impact on the production of a litre of milk or a kilo of meat or a bale of wool or whatever it might be. There's actually no information out there about that, or very limited information, and certainly across the whole of agriculture. So that's what we're working on at the moment, and by the middle of the year we'll hopefully, we will have all that information together. So what is the affordability challenge in agriculture? Over the last 5 years, energy cost as a proportion of production, pretty much across all agricultural sectors, has increased by 100%, and 35% in the last 2 years alone. And one of the things about agricultural production in terms of the ability to pass that increase in production down through the supply chain, it's really limited. Now, I don't need to revisit the $1 a litre milk story, but you could imagine that the likelihood that that policy being changed or $1 a litre milk price increasing with a story of increased energy production attached to that reason is probably highly unlikely. And as a result of that, Dairy Australia, for instance, has estimated that the farm gate milk price, directly as a result of energy price increases, will reduce by $89 million for dairy farmers across Australia, purely because it's a highly energy-intensive industry and they have no capacity to pass that price rise along through the supply chain. So, what are the sorts of farm practice and business practice changes that are happening throughout the agriculture sector as a result of that affordability challenge and the inability to pass that along? So I'm going to talk about 3 areas and pose or address that question about what are we talking about too much and not enough in relation to each of those 3 areas. The first one is change of energy sources. So the irrigation industry is a really heavy user of electricity in particular. And there's been significant change in recent times with the irrigation sector moving to more efficient irrigation methods that are generally a lot more energy intensive. So moving to pressurised irrigation systems as opposed to open channel irrigation is much, much more water efficient, better for the environment, but much more energy intensive and using a lot more electricity. Now, as a result of electricity price rises, that process of changing to more efficient irrigation measures is not just stopping, it's actually reversing. Irrigation farmers are pulling out electric pumps and going back to diesel just because it's more affordable, it's easier to do, less expensive. So there's a really significant impact on the environment, both in terms of dirtier fuel and less water efficient methods of irrigation, directly as a result of the price of electricity. So in that context, what are we talking too much about? And this is probably a bit ironic in the context of this discussion, but we're talking a bit too much about the impact on businesses and not enough about impact on the environment. this is leading to significant practice change and less efficient practices and dirtier fuel use and so on. It's obviously also driving a big change to the potential for renewables as another energy source in agriculture. There's enormous development going on in solar. Keep talking to people that are doing more interesting, innovative things in agriculture with solar generation, both at the farm business and household scale, but also significantly at the community scale. Community scale power generation in northwest New South Wales and southern Queensland, for instance, there's a couple of huge solar farms that have been built there that are supplying whole towns. The scale and storage capacity is not quite there in terms of readily usable commercial options that you can just pick up and go with, but it is being rapidly developed at the moment. So what are we talking too much about in terms of the solar generation and renewables in agriculture? To be honest, we're talking still a little bit too much about the technology. It's beyond proof of concept, it's happening, it's out there, it's achievable. What are we not talking enough about? There's some significant infrastructure and regulatory barriers that are actually preventing the implementation of this technology, particularly again at that community scale in rural areas. So things like the ability for that power generation to be fed back into the grid, and also access to government programs. There's a business that's building solar power stations in northwest New South Wales and southern Queensland that has been prevented from accessing some of the federal government programs that are available purely because the requirements of those programs require a certain size of business and experience in the industry before you can access them. And because they're new, brand new, small, Australian-based, they were prevented from accessing those programs in competition to large European-based companies who were able to do it. So there's some quite strange regulatory artefacts or barriers there that are preventing the implementation of technology, which is now getting well beyond proof of concept. Bioenergy. Agriculture has a huge capacity to generate fuel for bioenergy. It's already happening significantly overseas. The ethanol industry in the US and Brazil has significantly changed the agricultural environment globally in terms of markets and production processes. In Australia, it's not nearly as well developed, although interestingly there are, and it probably doesn't get talked about quite so much, but the sugar industry, for instance, bagasse, which is the product that's the sugarcane residue that's left after the sugar's taken out of the sugarcane, is burnt by sugar mills to generate electricity. And there are quite a number of sugar mills now that are completely self-reliant on power as a result of that process. Bioenergy from methane or biogas production from piggeries and that sort of thing. Again, really well established in Europe and being used more and more. There's been preliminary investigation of that in Australia. The economics don't quite stack up yet, but the potential is enormous to do more and more of that. So what do we talk too much about in this area? And, I guess this is, again, a bit tangential, but we talk too much about how there's no upside in intensive agriculture in Australia. And I don't think we talk enough about thinking a bit more holistically about intensive agriculture, particularly in regards to the energy sector and energy generation systems and the potential that intensive agriculture might have in that as another source of energy generation. Thank you. Hopefully that was quick enough.